When I grow up, I'll marry you.
You what?
Lily! Get away from him! Come on, let's go.
Bye.
The little girl pushed the pink plastic ring onto his smallest finger, her face serious in the way only 5-year-olds could manage. "When I grow up, I'll marry you," she said, standing on her toes to reach his hand where he sat slumped on the swing. The other children had run to the opposite side of the playground the moment he arrived, whispering and pointing at the scars that covered his face and neck, at the way his body seemed too large and uneven for a child. He stared at the ring, barely fitting past his knuckle, unable to form words past the tightness in his throat. Her mother's voice cut through the moment like a knife, sharp and panicked, calling her daughter's name 3 times before appearing at the fence. The woman grabbed the girl's arm and yanked her backward, her face twisted with something between fear and disgust. She yelled about staying away from that thing, about not touching strange children, about how they were leaving right now. The girl looked back over her shoulder as she was dragged toward the parking lot, reaching out one hand, but her mother's grip was too strong. He sat there turning the plastic ring on his finger, watching their car pull away, and something inside him understood this was how it would always be. 18 years later, Frank unloaded crates from the back of a delivery truck, his movements efficient despite the weight that would require 2 normal men. The afternoon sun beat down on the industrial district, but he kept his wool cap pulled low over his forehead and his flannel shirt buttoned to his neck despite the heat. His supervisor shouted orders from across the loading dock, barely looking at him, treating him like equipment rather than a person. Frank had learned this was preferable to direct eye contact, which usually came with poorly hidden revulsion or manufactured pity. He stacked the last crate and wiped sweat from his jaw with the back of his hand, then reached for his backpack sitting on the concrete barrier. The other workers had already left for lunch, walking in a tight group toward the food trucks on the corner, never once asking if he wanted to join them. His hands moved automatically, checking the straps on his bag, when he noticed a woman standing near the truck's cab watching him. She was small, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled into a messy bun and paint stains on her jeans. Most people who stared at him did it from a distance, or looked away quickly when caught, but she walked directly toward him with purpose in her stride. He instinctively turned his face to the side, giving her his better profile, the one with fewer scars, though it never really helped. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough that he could smell her perfume mixed with dust, and asked if he did side jobs. Her voice was steady, no tremor of fear or hesitation that usually accompanied requests from strangers. He lifted his eyes to meet hers for just a second before dropping his gaze back to the ground, nodding once. She explained quickly, words tumbling over each other, about a building full of junk she needed cleared in 3 days, about paying cash at the end of each shift, about needing someone strong who could work fast. Around them, pedestrians slowed their pace. A mother pulled her child closer to her hip, and an older man stopped pretending to check his phone to openly stare. Frank reached into his pocket for a pen, took the receipt she offered, and wrote his phone number in careful block letters. His fingers dwarfed the small paper, making the act look clumsy, though his handwriting was precise. He handed it back without speaking and walked away. His shoulders curled forward, making his large frame take up as little space as possible. The memory came without warning as he walked the 6 blocks to his apartment, triggered by nothing he could identify. He was 7, sitting in the school cafeteria at a table by himself, eating the sandwich he'd packed that morning. A teacher approached and suggested gently that he might be more comfortable eating in the counselor's office, away from the other students, where he wouldn't feel so self-conscious. He'd nodded and gathered his things, understanding even then that the suggestion wasn't about his comfort, but about theirs. By the time he was 12, he'd stopped trying to join groups, stopped raising his hand in class, stopped hoping that someone might choose him for a team or a project. He'd learned to recognize the look that crossed people's faces when they first saw him, the slight backward step, the tightening around their eyes, the way they'd find reasons to be somewhere else. His mother had done her best, defending him fiercely to teachers and parents who complained, But even she'd looked tired by the end, worn down by the constant battle. When she died 3 years ago, the funeral was small, and he'd stood at the back, giving people space to mourn without his presence making them uncomfortable. His apartment was a studio on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator, which meant most residents avoided him simply because they never crossed paths in the lobby or mailroom. He unlocked the door and dropped his backpack on the floor, then pulled off his cap and shirt, tossing them toward the hamper in the corner. His reflection caught in the bathroom mirror as he passed, and he stopped despite himself, cataloging what others saw. The thick, raised scars running across his forehead and down his left cheek, the way his jaw jutted slightly to one side, the rough texture of his skin where surgeries had been performed when he was too young to remember. He'd been born this way, the doctors had explained to his mother in clinical terms he'd overheard through hospital walls, a combination of factors that resulted in severe facial and skeletal differences. No accident, no tragedy to blame, just the particular cruelty of genetics and chance. He turned away from the mirror and moved to the small kitchen, pulling leftover rice from the refrigerator and eating it cold, standing at the counter. His phone buzzed in his pocket 20 minutes later. The message was from an unknown number, containing an address and a time for tomorrow morning, followed by a simple, "Thank you." He typed back a thumbs-up emoji and set the phone down, then lay on his bed staring at the water-stained ceiling. The plastic ring from the playground was long gone, lost or thrown away by his mother during one of their moves, but sometimes he could still feel the slight pressure of it on his smallest finger, the only kind gesture from a stranger he could remember from his childhood. He wondered if the girl ever thought about that day, or if it was just a forgotten moment in a life full of better memories. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of small hands reaching toward him, always just out of reach. Frank arrived at the address 30 minutes early, standing across the street from a 3-story brick building with boarded windows and a faded sign reading, Thompson Hardware Supply. The morning air still held some coolness, and he used the time to observe the neighborhood, cataloging exit routes and potential complications the way he always did before entering new spaces. An elderly woman shuffled past with a shopping cart, giving him a wide berth without looking up, her shoulders tensing until she'd put a full block between them. He'd learned over the years that being early and being quiet were the best strategies for existing in the world, arriving before crowds gathered and leaving before he became a topic of conversation. The building looked abandoned, its brick facade crumbling at the corners, weeds growing through cracks in the front steps. A rusted security gate hung partially open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Olivia arrived exactly on time, pulling up in a dented sedan that coughed when she turned off the engine. She got out carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag, spotted him across the street, and waved him over with her free hand. He crossed slowly, giving her time to change her mind, or remember she'd left something in her car, or invent any of the dozen excuses people use to avoid him. She handed him one of the coffees instead, holding it up until he took it, then pulled a set of keys from her pocket and unlocked the gate with some effort. The metal shrieked as she pushed it open, echoing down the empty street. She glanced at him over her shoulder while walking to the front door, checking that he was following, and something in her expression wasn't the careful neutrality he was used to seeing. She looked tired and stressed, but not afraid, and that difference made him grip the coffee cup tighter, feeling the heat through the cardboard sleeve. Inside, the building smelled of mold and rust and something sweetly rotten he couldn't quite place. Dust hung thick in the air, visible in the streams of morning light coming through gaps in the boards. The main floor was filled with industrial shelving units, most still loaded with ancient inventory, boxes of nails and screws and tools that hadn't been touched in decades. Olivia set her coffee on a relatively clean patch of counter and spread her arms wide, explaining that her father had owned the business until a stroke killed him 6 months ago, that she'd been avoiding dealing with it until the bank forced her hand, that she needed everything cleared so she could sell the building and settle his debts. Her voice echoed in the empty space, and she talked faster than necessary, filling silence the way people did when they were nervous. Frank set his own coffee down and walked to the nearest shelving unit, testing its stability with one hand. The metal frame was bolted to the wall but rusted through at the base, ready to collapse under its own weight. He looked back at Olivia and nodded, then gripped the frame with both hands and pulled. The bolts came free with a screech of protesting metal, and the entire unit tilted forward under his control. He walked it away from the wall in measured steps, the weight making the floor creak but never testing his strength, then lowered it carefully onto its side. Dust exploded around them, making Olivia cough and wave her hand in front of her face, backing toward the door for fresh air. He continued working methodically, disconnecting shelves from walls, stacking boxes by category, creating clear paths through the chaos. An hour passed, then two, with only the sounds of metal scraping and boxes thudding to break the silence. When Olivia returned from wherever she'd gone, she brought bottles of water and protein bars, setting them within his reach on top of a crate. He nodded his thanks and kept working, waiting until she'd moved away before taking a break, never wanting to make her watch him eat or drink, knowing how his misaligned jaw made those simple acts look awkward and difficult. By midday, they'd cleared a third of the main floor, creating a growing pile of scrap metal outside the back door and organizing salvageable inventory into categories for donation or sale. Olivia worked alongside him when possible, though her contribution was minimal compared to what he could accomplish alone, carrying small boxes while he hefted furniture and equipment. She tried making conversation several times, asking about the weather or commenting on the surprising value of some vintage tools, but he only responded with nods or single words, keeping his answers short to avoid showing his teeth, which grew in crooked and overlapping. He'd learned that silence was safer than speech, that people filled quiet spaces with their own assumptions, usually kinder than reality. The afternoon brought an incident that made his chest tighten with old familiar dread. Olivia had gone out for lunch, leaving him alone to dismantle a back storage area, when three men entered through the propped-open front door. They wore work clothes and carried themselves with the casual aggression of people used to getting their way, calling out for anyone working the property. Frank stayed silent in the back room, hoping they'd leave on their own, but one of them spotted his shadow, and all three came closer, spreading out slightly in a formation he recognized as territorial. The tallest one asked what he was doing there, if he had permission to be on the property, his tone suggesting he already assumed the answer was no. Frank straightened to his full height, which put him several inches above the tallest man, and pulled the crumpled work order from his pocket, holding it out without speaking. The three men stepped back in unison when they got a clear look at his face, their expressions shifting from aggressive to uncertain to disgusted in rapid succession. One of them muttered something under his breath that Frank didn't catch but could guess the content of. Then they left quickly, the door banging shut behind them. He stood there for several minutes after they'd gone, his hands shaking slightly, adrenaline making his heart pound harder than any physical labor could. This was the pattern of his life, the constant low-grade threat of violence or rejection, the way people looked at him and saw something that needed to be removed or controlled. He'd been in 3 actual fights growing up, none of which he'd started, all of which had ended with him being blamed despite witnesses, because who would believe the monster was the victim? By 16, he'd learned that making himself scarce was the only reliable defense, that staying away from people meant they couldn't hurt him and he couldn't accidentally hurt them by existing in their space. He returned to work with more force than necessary, yanking apart wooden pallets and tossing them onto the scrap pile, using physical exertion to burn off the anger and shame he couldn't express any other way. Olivia came back 20 minutes later with sandwiches, taking in the increased pile of debris with a low whistle of appreciation. She handed him one of the wrapped sandwiches and sat on an overturned bucket, unwrapping her own and taking a bite before gesturing for him to sit nearby. He hesitated, as he always did, before lowering himself onto a crate that groaned under his weight. They ate in silence, and he was careful to angle his face away from her, chewing slowly to minimize the sounds his jaw made. She finished first and crumpled the wrapper, tossing it into a garbage bag they'd hung on a post, then stood and stretched her back with both hands pressed to her spine. She thanked him for the work he'd done, her voice sincere and tired, then mentioned she'd be back tomorrow morning at the same time. He nodded, gathered his things, and left through the back door, avoiding the front where passers-by might stare, walking home through alleys and side streets where his presence would disturb the fewest people. That night in his apartment, he stood under a cold shower for longer than necessary, letting the water run over his head and shoulders until the hot water tank emptied completely. The plastic ring from childhood was gone, but the memory of it circled his thoughts like something alive. The way that little girl had looked at him without flinching, without pity, just a child making a promise she couldn't possibly understand. He wondered if the woman hiring him reminded him of anyone, though her face triggered no specific memories, just a vague sense of something familiar he couldn't place. He dried off and fell into bed without bothering to dress, his body exhausted but his mind still racing, cataloging the day's small humiliations and the strange novelty of someone treating him like a normal worker, instead of a problem to be solved. Sleep came eventually, pulling him under into dreams of empty playgrounds and hands that reached but never quite touched. The second day began with rain, a steady drizzle that turned the morning gray and made the brick building look even more derelict than before. Frank arrived early again, standing under the overhang of a closed butcher shop across the street, watching water run down the gutter and collect in potholes. Olivia's car appeared through the mist exactly on time, splashing through puddles and parking in the same spot as yesterday. She got out wearing a raincoat too big for her frame and carrying a thermos and a single coffee cup, jogging across the street toward the building before noticing him in the shadows. She stopped mid-stride and redirected toward him, holding out the coffee cup with a questioning look. He took it, and they stood there for a moment under the narrow overhang, shoulders almost touching, steam rising from the cup between them. She asked if he was ready to work, and he nodded, following her across the street and through the gate that screamed again in protest. Inside, the humidity made everything worse, amplifying the smell of decay and making dust stick to every surface. Olivia shrugged off her raincoat and hung it on a nail, revealing a tank top and work pants that were already smudged with dirt. She tied her hair back with an efficiency that spoke of routine, then pointed to the second floor, explaining that her father had used it for storage and office space, that it was probably worse than the ground level, that she'd understand if he wanted to quit after seeing it. Frank climbed the stairs without responding, each step creaking under his weight, the banister wobbling dangerously when he gripped it for balance. The second floor was darker, most windows boarded completely, and his eyes took a moment to adjust before the full scope of the disaster became clear. Filing cabinets tilted at dangerous angles, their drawers spilling paperwork across warped floorboards, and water damage had created dark blooms of mold across the ceiling. Cardboard boxes had dissolved into pulpy masses, their contents fused into unidentifiable lumps, and the smell of rot was thick enough to make his eyes water. He worked for 3 hours straight, carrying load after load down the narrow staircase, improvising a makeshift ramp from wooden planks when it became clear the stairs couldn't handle repeated trips with heavy loads. Olivia worked beside him when space allowed, sorting through papers for anything that needed to be saved before disposal, occasionally finding photographs or documents that made her pause and stare with an expression he couldn't read. She found a picture of her father standing in front of the building in better days, the sign freshly painted, his arm around a woman who must have been Olivia's mother based on the resemblance. She held it carefully by the edges, water-damaged and faded, then slipped it into her pocket and returned to work without comment. Frank understood that kind of loss, the way it sat heavy and quiet inside a person, how pointless words felt when grief was too big for language. He'd felt it when his mother died, sitting in their empty apartment surrounded by her things, knowing no one would come to help him sort through them, knowing he'd have to do it alone like he did everything else. Around noon, they broke for lunch, and Olivia disappeared for 20 minutes, returning with Chinese food in paper containers that she set on a relatively clean section of floor. She sat cross-legged and opened both containers, gesturing for him to take one. And this time he sat directly across from her instead of maintaining distance. They ate with plastic forks, the silence comfortable rather than awkward, broken only by the rain drumming on the roof and the occasional creak of the building settling. She asked suddenly if he'd always lived in the city, and he shook his head, offering no elaboration. She told him she'd grown up here, left for college in another state, came back when her father got sick, and now felt trapped by circumstances she hadn't chosen. Her voice carried frustration without self-pity, a practical assessment of a situation she was simply dealing with. He understood that too. The way life sometimes put people in corners where the only option was to keep moving forward because stopping meant drowning. The afternoon brought physical contact, unexpected and brief, but significant for its normalcy. They were maneuvering a metal desk through a doorway that was 6 inches too narrow, Olivia pulling from the front while Frank pushed from behind, when the desk suddenly broke free and lurched forward. Olivia stumbled backward, and Frank instinctively reached out to steady her, his hand catching her upper arm and holding her upright. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds before she'd regained her balance and he'd snatched his hand back. But in that moment, she'd looked up at him without flinching, her expression grateful rather than revolted, treating his touch like any normal person's help rather than something contaminating. She thanked him and returned to work immediately. No awkwardness or forced distance, and that simple acceptance hit him harder than expected. Most people avoided touching him like he carried disease, and the few times accidental contact occurred, they'd pull away quickly and find reasons to wash their hands or wipe their clothes. By late afternoon, they'd cleared 2/3 of the second floor, making visible progress that seemed to lift Olivia's mood despite her obvious exhaustion. She sat on the stairs drinking water and surveying the space, calculating out loud how much more work remained and whether they'd finish in the agreed 3 days. Frank descended to the ground floor to continue sorting scrap metal, giving her space to rest, and found himself thinking about the way she'd looked at him without hesitation, the normalcy of it, the strange feeling it created in his chest that he couldn't name. He'd spent so many years being invisible or being the thing people looked away from that genuine eye contact felt almost aggressive in its directness, like she was demanding he acknowledge his own existence instead of letting him hide behind silence and avoidance. He was carrying an armload of copper piping to the scrap pile when he noticed a group of teenagers gathered near the back alley, their voices carrying through the open door. They were passing around a phone, laughing at something on the screen, and when one of them glanced up and saw him standing in the doorway, the laughter cut off abruptly. The kid said something to the others, and they all turned to look, their expressions shifting through curiosity to shock to performative bravery. One of them made a comment about horror movies, another laughed nervously, and a third pulled out his phone to take a picture. Frank stepped back into the building and closed the door, securing the deadbolt and leaning against it until their voices faded down the alley. His hands were shaking again, rage and shame mixing into something toxic that sat in his throat like acid. This was the other pattern of his life, the casual cruelty of people who treated him like entertainment, who saw him and thought immediately of monsters and movies instead of recognizing another human being. When Olivia came downstairs 10 minutes later, he'd composed himself enough to continue working, though his movements were sharper and less controlled than before. She noticed but didn't comment, instead joining him in sorting through boxes of old receipts and invoices that probably should have been shredded years ago. They worked until the rain stopped and the light started fading, creating long shadows across the floor. And when Olivia finally called it a day, Frank gathered his things quickly, eager to leave before darkness fell completely. She walked him to the door, thanked him again for the day's work, and mentioned she'd see him tomorrow morning same time. He nodded and left through the front for once, the street mostly empty at this hour, walking fast toward his neighborhood and the safety of his locked apartment where no one could stare or comment or take pictures of him like he was an attraction at a freak show. The third day dawned clear and warm, sunlight burning off the previous day's humidity and making the city feel almost clean. Frank arrived to find Olivia already inside, the gate propped open and music playing from a small speaker she'd set on the counter. She greeted him with an actual smile, explaining that she'd been up since 5 doing paperwork, that the bank had agreed to extend the deadline by a week, that maybe they'd actually pull this off. Her energy was contagious in a way he wasn't used to, and he found himself working faster, driven by her optimism even though he maintained his usual silence. They tackled the 3rd floor together, a space that had served as both apartment and office for her father during his final years, and the personal nature of the items made the work feel more intrusive, like they were sorting through memories that hadn't been meant for outside eyes. They found clothes still hanging in a closet, medications lined up on a bathroom sink, a bed made with military precision that no one had slept in since the old man's final stroke. Olivia moved through the space with visible emotion, touching things gently before packing them away, occasionally sharing small stories about her father's habits or preferences. She mentioned how he'd insisted on wearing a tie every day even after retiring, how he'd collected vintage radios and spent hours repairing them in the evening, how he'd been a difficult man but a reliable one, someone who kept his promises even when it cost him. Frank listened while working, and something about her tone made him think of his own mother, the way she'd fought so hard to make the world treat him fairly, how tired that fight had made her, how alone she must have felt carrying that weight with no one to share it. Olivia asked if his parents were still alive, and he shook his head once, offering no details. She said she was sorry, and he believed her because her voice didn't carry the empty politeness most people used when expressing condolences. They continued packing in heavier silence, boxing up a lifetime of accumulated possessions that would mostly end up in donation centers or landfills, and Frank thought about how little remained of a person after they died, how quickly their physical presence got erased from the world. His mother's apartment had been emptied in 2 days, her belongings so minimal that everything fit in a dozen boxes he'd stored in a facility he couldn't afford to keep paying for. He'd been meaning to sort through them for 3 years now, but couldn't bring himself to do it, knowing that once he threw away her clothes and books and the photographs of him as a child, there'd be almost no proof she'd existed at all. Around mid-morning, Olivia's phone rang, and she stepped into the hallway to take the call, her voice rising in frustration as she argued with someone about money or dates or complications Frank couldn't quite follow. When she returned, her face was flushed, and her hands were shaking slightly as she shoved the phone back in her pocket. She apologized for the interruption and explained that her ex-boyfriend had been calling repeatedly, claiming she owed him money from when they lived together, threatening to take her to small claims court if she didn't pay immediately. Her voice carried more exhaustion than anger, and Frank recognized the particular weariness of someone dealing with harassment they didn't have the resources to properly fight. He kept working, unsure how to respond, and she sat on a box with her head in her hands for a moment before forcing herself upright and returning to the task. Lunch came from a deli 2 blocks away, and they ate on the front steps in the sunshine, watching people pass on the sidewalk, most of whom crossed to the other side when they noticed Frank sitting there. Olivia either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, talking about her plans for the money from selling the building, how she'd use some to settle debts and save the rest for a fresh start somewhere smaller, maybe a town where living was cheaper and she could work remotely doing graphic design. She asked if he'd ever thought about leaving the city, and he nodded, though he'd never actually considered it seriously because moving required resources and connections he didn't have. The question made him wonder what it would be like to start over somewhere no one knew him, where his first impression wasn't his appearance, though he knew realistically that his face would follow him anywhere, that geographic change wouldn't alter how people reacted to him. The afternoon brought the ex-boyfriend in person, a man in his early 30s with expensive sneakers and an aggressive posture who showed up demanding to speak with Olivia. She went outside to talk with him on the sidewalk, and Frank watched through the window as the conversation escalated, the man moving closer with each sentence while Olivia held her ground. When he grabbed her arm roughly, Frank didn't think, just moved, pushing through the door and crossing the sidewalk in 4 long strides. He didn't touch the man, didn't speak, just positioned himself directly beside Olivia, so close their shoulders brushed, his full height and breadth making the ex-boyfriend look small by comparison. The man released Olivia's arm immediately and stepped back, his face cycling through emotions before settling on fear badly disguised as disgust. He called Olivia a freak for hiring freaks, said he'd be back with the police, and retreated to his car quickly, peeling away from the curb with unnecessary speed. Olivia touched Frank's forearm lightly, a gesture of thanks that lasted only a second before she withdrew, but he felt the warmth of her fingers even after she'd pulled away. She apologized for bringing her problems to work, and he shook his head to dismiss the apology, returning inside to continue clearing the third floor. The contact had felt different than the accidental steadying from the previous day, more intentional, acknowledging his presence as protective rather than threatening. He thought about it while carrying boxes, the simple fact of another person choosing to touch him without being forced to, without immediately regretting it, without looking for the nearest place to sanitize afterward. Such small gestures probably meant nothing to people who experienced regular physical contact, but to Frank, they were rare enough to be memorable, to be turned over and examined like precious objects. By evening, they'd finished the third floor completely, the space empty except for built-in fixtures and the echoes their voices made in the vacant rooms. Olivia locked up carefully, testing each window and door, clearly exhausted but satisfied with the progress. She paid him for the 3 days in cash as promised, counting out bills from an envelope she pulled from her car, then hesitated before asking if he'd be willing to continue working through the following week at the same rate. The bank extension meant she had time to do the job right, to salvage anything valuable rather than just dumping everything, and she'd come to trust his judgment about what was worth keeping versus discarding. Frank agreed with a nod, pocketing the money without counting it, and she smiled in a way that created lines at the corners of her eyes, transforming her face from merely tired to genuinely happy. Walking home that night, Frank allowed himself to think about possibilities he usually suppressed, about what it might feel like to have someone in his life who didn't see him as a burden or a project or a source of pity. Olivia treated him like a coworker, someone useful and competent, maintaining professional boundaries while still being genuinely friendly, and that balance felt almost perfect because it didn't demand more emotional labor than he knew how to give. He'd never had a real friendship, never been part of a social group, never experienced the casual intimacy of people who chose to spend time together rather than being forced into proximity. The thought of wanting more than what currently existed between him and Olivia felt dangerous, like building expectations that could only lead to disappointment, but he couldn't quite stop himself from wondering if maybe, just this once, things might be different. The following week settled into a rhythm that Frank had never experienced in his adult life. He showed up every morning at 8, and Olivia was always there waiting with coffee and a casual greeting that made him feel expected rather than merely tolerated. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, punctuated by her occasional observations about items they found or stories about her father's business practices. She learned his preferences without him having to state them, giving him space when he needed it, but engaging him in conversation when he seemed receptive, reading his body language with an accuracy that suggested she was paying closer attention than most people bothered to. He found himself lowering some of his usual guards, making eye contact more frequently, even offering his own occasional observations about the work or the building, his voice rough from disuse but functional. By Wednesday, they'd developed small traditions that felt significant precisely because they were shared. Olivia brought lunch every day at noon, always getting enough for both of them, and they ate together on the front steps when weather permitted or at the counter inside when it rained. She started asking his opinion on decisions about what to keep or sell, genuinely considering his answers rather than just being polite, and Frank discovered he had decent instincts about the value of vintage tools and equipment. When she found an old radio that might have been part of her father's collection, she spent an hour carefully cleaning it while Frank worked nearby, and her focused concentration reminded him of his mother's face when she'd been deep in thought, that same quality of being fully present in a moment. Thursday brought a complication that tested the boundaries of their developing friendship. Olivia arrived 20 minutes late, her eyes red and her movements jerky with barely controlled emotion. She apologized and dove immediately into work, attacking boxes with more force than necessary. clearly using physical labor to avoid whatever was bothering her. Frank let her work in silence for an hour before gently taking a box from her hands and setting it down, then gesturing toward the steps where they usually ate lunch. She resisted for a moment before following, sitting heavily and pulling her knees to her chest in a posture that made her look much younger than her age. After several minutes of silence, she explained that her ex-boyfriend had filed a police report claiming she'd stolen money from him, that he was harassing her through mutual friends, that she couldn't afford a lawyer and didn't know how to make him stop. Frank listened without offering solutions he didn't have, just sitting beside her and letting her talk until the words ran out, and she slumped against the brick wall, exhausted by the weight of everything she was carrying. She apologized again for dumping her problems on him, and he shook his head, wanting to say that listening wasn't a burden, that he'd spent his whole life being talked over or around but never to, that her willingness to treat him like someone capable of holding her pain felt like trust. He didn't know how to reciprocate properly. The words didn't come, trapped behind decades of learned silence, so he just sat there beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, offering the only comfort he knew how to give, which was simply presence without judgment or expectation. They returned to work after lunch, the atmosphere heavier but somehow more honest, like a barrier had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Olivia worked closer to him throughout the afternoon, not quite touching but near enough that he was constantly aware of her presence, and he found himself adjusting his movements to accommodate hers, creating a silent partnership that felt natural despite his lack of experience with collaboration. When she accidentally brushed against his arm while reaching for a tool, neither of them pulled away immediately, letting the contact linger for a beat longer than necessary before returning to their separate tasks. Frank's awareness of her became almost overwhelming, noticing details he'd never paid attention to with anyone else. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, how she pushed hair behind her ear with her left hand, the small sound of satisfaction she made when solving a problem. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected gift that shifted something fundamental between them. They were sorting through the last section of the second floor when Olivia found a metal lockbox buried under old invoices, its combination lock rusted but still functional. She tried several possible combinations based on her father's important dates before finally getting it open, revealing a stack of cash, some old photographs, and a small velvet box. She opened the velvet box carefully and pulled out a simple gold ring, clearly a woman's wedding band, worn smooth from years of wear. She stared at it for a long moment, tears tracking down her face silently, and explained that this had been her mother's ring, that her father had kept it after her mother's death 20 years ago, that she'd assumed it had been buried with him. She slipped it onto her right ring finger where it fit perfectly, holding her hand up to catch the light streaming through gaps in the boards. She turned to Frank suddenly and asked if he'd ever been in love, the question catching him off guard with its directness. He thought about the little girl in the playground, the plastic ring she'd put on his finger, the promise she'd made that both of them had been too young to understand, and he realized that was probably the closest he'd ever come to experiencing love or even the possibility of it. He shook his head slowly, and Olivia looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between sadness and curiosity, and another emotion he didn't have a name for. She said that seemed impossible, that someone as kind and patient as he was should have people lining up to be close to him, and the statement was so divorced from his actual experience that he almost laughed, though the sound came out as more of a rough exhale. She didn't push the topic further, respecting his silence, but her hand reached out and squeezed his forearm briefly before she turned back to examining the contents of the box. That evening, Frank walked home through the increasingly familiar streets, his mind replaying the conversation and trying to understand what had shifted between them. Olivia's touch had become more frequent throughout the week, small contacts that seemed unconscious rather than deliberate, her hand on his shoulder when getting his attention, her arm brushing his when they worked in tight spaces, her fingers grazing his when passing tools back and forth. He'd spent so long avoiding physical contact that each instance felt significant, catalogued and remembered like rare events. The possibility that she might not be repulsed by him, that she might actually enjoy his presence, felt too fragile to examine too closely. But he couldn't stop himself from hoping, despite knowing how dangerous hope was for someone like him. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonable heat, the kind that made the city smell like hot concrete and garbage. Frank showed up early and found Olivia already inside with a fan running, wearing shorts and a tank top that revealed bruises on her upper arm in the shape of fingerprints. He recognized them immediately from the encounter with her ex-boyfriend, though they'd darkened significantly since that day. She noticed him looking and touched the bruises self-consciously, explaining that the ex had shown up at her apartment the previous night, banging on her door and yelling threats until a neighbor threatened to call the police. She'd filed for a restraining order that morning but wouldn't have the official paperwork for several days, and in the meantime she was sleeping at a friend's place and avoiding her regular routines. Frank felt rage building in his chest, the kind that made his vision narrow and his hands curl into fists, because violence against someone he'd come to care about felt personal in a way that violence against himself never had. He asked for her ex's name and address, the first full sentence he'd spoken to her all week, and his voice came out rougher and lower than usual. Olivia looked startled by the question and quickly said she didn't want him getting involved, that it would only make things worse, that she just needed to wait out the legal process and stay away from places the ex knew to look for her. Frank understood she was probably right, that inserting himself into the situation would likely escalate rather than resolve it. But the desire to protect her felt visceral and overwhelming. He'd never felt protective of anyone except his mother, never had someone in his life whose safety mattered more than his own comfort, and the intensity of the feeling scared him almost as much as the ex-boyfriend's threats should have scared him. They returned to work without resolving the tension, both of them moving through tasks mechanically while their minds were clearly elsewhere. The second week brought visible progress on the building, but growing complications outside it. Olivia's ex-boyfriend began showing up on the street during their work hours, parking his car where he could watch the front entrance, never approaching but making his presence known. Olivia pretended not to notice, keeping her attention focused on the work, but Frank could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she jumped at sudden noises, how she'd started positioning herself deeper in the building away from windows. On Tuesday, the ex-boyfriend got out of his car and stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, staring at the building entrance, his posture aggressive enough that several pedestrians crossed the street to avoid him. Frank stood in the doorway the entire time, making himself visible, using his size and appearance as a deterrent, the same way he'd learned to use it defensively throughout his life. Wednesday brought police involvement that made everything worse. The ex-boyfriend filed a false report claiming Olivia had violated the restraining order by contacting him through social media, providing fabricated screenshots as evidence. 2 officers showed up at the building to question her, treating her with suspicion despite her calm explanations and the obvious holes in the ex-boyfriend's story. Frank watched from inside while they questioned her on the sidewalk, his presence seemingly forgotten by everyone involved. And he recognized the particular frustration of dealing with systems designed to help, but often making situations more complicated. When Olivia came back inside, she was visibly shaken, her confidence from previous days replaced by the hunted look of someone running out of options. She explained that the detective had told her to document everything, to avoid all contact with the ex-boyfriend, to consider moving to a new location temporarily, advice that was practical but impossible for someone with limited resources and nowhere else to go. Thursday afternoon brought the confrontation Frank had been dreading. They were loading donations into Olivia's car when the ex-boyfriend appeared, walking up fast with a wild expression that suggested he'd been drinking or using something stronger. He started yelling accusations, calling Olivia names that made Frank's jaw clench, demanding money he claimed she owed, though Olivia had shown Frank the bank records proving she'd paid her half of all shared expenses. The ex-boyfriend moved closer with each word, backing Olivia against her car, and Frank stepped between them without thinking, his body blocking access, his size making the ex-boyfriend look like a child by comparison. The ex-boyfriend tried to go around him, and Frank shifted to maintain the barrier, still not touching or threatening, just existing as an immovable obstacle. The ex-boyfriend made a critical mistake then, pulling out his phone to take pictures while saying he'd show everyone what kind of freak Olivia was spending time with, that she must be desperate or crazy to hire something like Frank. The words hit their target, shame flooding through Frank's chest, because despite everything, despite Olivia's kindness and apparent acceptance, he'd never really believed she saw past his appearance. The ex-boyfriend continued, getting braver as Frank stood frozen, saying that people like Frank should be locked away, that he should be grateful anyone let him exist in public, that Olivia was probably using him for heavy lifting because no one else would tolerate being near him. Each word landed with precision, targeting every fear and insecurity Frank had carried his entire life, confirming what he'd always believed about how the world saw him. Olivia moved then, pushing past Frank and getting directly in her ex-boyfriend's face, her voice low and deadly as she told him to leave immediately or she'd call the police herself. The ex-boyfriend laughed and said the police wouldn't do anything, that he had connections through his lawyer father, that she was powerless and stupid for thinking she could escape him. Olivia pulled her phone out and started dialing, reading the emergency number out loud, and the ex-boyfriend's bravado cracked slightly, his eyes darting to Frank and then back to Olivia. He warned her this wasn't over, that she'd regret making his life difficult, then retreated to his car with forced casualness, peeling away from the curb with enough speed to leave rubber marks on the asphalt. Olivia stood there breathing hard, her hands shaking, and when she turned to Frank, her expression held fury, but also something that looked like determination. She grabbed his hand, the contact shocking in its directness, and pulled him back inside the building. She didn't let go immediately, instead holding on while she leaned against the wall and tried to control her breathing. And Frank stood there acutely aware of how small her hand felt in his, how warm her skin was, how natural it felt despite him never having held anyone's hand since childhood. When she finally released him, she apologized for her ex-boyfriend's words, saying they weren't true, that Frank wasn't any of the things that man had said. Frank wanted to believe her but couldn't quite manage it, decades of experience teaching him that people's momentary kindness often evaporated when tested by social pressure or public opinion. He pulled away gently and returned to loading boxes, putting distance between them before she could see how much the interaction had affected him. Friday brought an unexpected resolution to the harassment problem, though not through any official channels. Frank arrived early and found the ex-boyfriend's car parked in its usual spot, but this time there was a police car parked directly behind it. 2 officers were talking to the ex-boyfriend, who looked significantly less confident than during his previous appearances. One officer glanced toward the building, saw Frank standing in the doorway, and walked over to explain that they'd received multiple complaints about someone harassing a woman at this address, that the ex-boyfriend had outstanding warrants for unpaid tickets that gave them cause to arrest him, that they'd be escorting him to the station for processing. The officer's tone was professional but carried an undercurrent of satisfaction, suggesting he'd dealt with men like Olivia's ex-boyfriend before and enjoyed shutting them down. Frank nodded but didn't speak, and the officer returned to his partner, helping load the ex-boyfriend into the back of their cruiser. Olivia arrived 10 minutes later, stopping short when she saw the police car pulling away. Frank explained what had happened in his halting way, and her relief was visible, her whole body relaxing like she'd been holding herself tense for days. She hugged him suddenly, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face against his chest, the contact so unexpected that Frank froze completely, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. She held on for several seconds before releasing him and stepping back, apologizing for the impulsiveness but not for the sentiment. She said he'd probably saved her life, or at least her sanity this week, that she didn't know how to thank him properly. Frank wanted to say that her presence in his life was already more than he'd ever expected, that these 2 weeks of being treated like a normal person had given him something he couldn't name but desperately needed. But the words remained trapped behind his damaged vocal cords and lifetime of silence. The 3rd week brought an intensity to their interactions that Frank recognized as dangerous, but couldn't bring himself to resist. Olivia had stopped maintaining the professional distance she'd carefully preserved before, touching him frequently and naturally, standing close enough that he could smell her shampoo, making prolonged eye contact that felt intimate rather than merely friendly. She'd started sharing more personal information, talking about her failed relationships and her fears about the future, her tendency to choose partners who needed fixing rather than ones who were already stable. She mentioned feeling safe around him in a way she'd never felt with previous boyfriends. How his silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. How his size made her feel protected instead of threatened. Frank listened and tried not to read too much into her words, but his chest ached with wanting things he'd convinced himself were impossible. Monday afternoon, they finished clearing the last of the building's contents, the space finally empty except for the bones of the structure itself. Olivia walked through each floor, her footsteps echoing in vacant rooms, clearly emotional about closing this chapter of her life. Frank followed at a distance, giving her space for whatever goodbye she was processing. And when she finally stopped in her father's old bedroom, she sat on the floor and cried silently, her shoulders shaking. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to leave or stay, ultimately choosing to sit against the opposite wall, far enough to not be intrusive but close enough that she knew he was there. She cried for maybe 15 minutes before wiping her face with her sleeves and looking across the room at him. She said she couldn't imagine having done this without him, that she'd been prepared to hate every minute of clearing the building but had somehow ended up looking forward to coming here every day because it meant spending time with him. The confession hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Frank didn't dare examine too closely. He'd been trained by life to expect the worst, to anticipate rejection or betrayal, to protect himself by never hoping for more than he had. But Olivia's words suggested possibility, the terrifying chance that someone might actually want his presence beyond its usefulness, might see value in him beyond his ability to lift heavy objects. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out, his throat tight with emotions he didn't know how to express. And Olivia smiled sadly, like she understood his silence better than words could have communicated. She stood and offered her hand to help him up, and when he took it, she didn't let go immediately, instead, lacing her fingers through his and leading him down the stairs and out of the building for the last time. Tuesday was dedicated to final cleaning and minor repairs to make the building presentable for potential buyers. They worked side by side with mops and scrapers, removing years of accumulated grime, and the physical labor felt meditative after the emotional intensity of the previous day. Olivia had brought her speaker again, playing music that created a different atmosphere than their usual working silence, and she occasionally sang along softly when a song she particularly liked came on. Frank found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, memorizing details he knew he'd want to remember later. The way she stretched onto her toes to reach high corners, how she'd secured her hair in a messy bun that pieces kept escaping from, the small constellation of freckles across her shoulders that her tank top revealed. He was acutely aware that their time working together was ending, that once the building sold, he'd have no excuse to see her regularly, and the thought created a hollow feeling in his chest that he tried to ignore. Wednesday brought real estate agents touring the building, sleek professionals with expensive shoes and practiced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes when they looked at Frank. Olivia introduced him as her contractor, a term that made him feel more legitimate than he'd felt in years, and most agents shook his hand perfunctorily before returning their attention to the property. One agent, younger than the others and clearly trying too hard, made a comment about how security wouldn't be an issue with Frank around, laughing at his own joke in a way that suggested he thought he was being clever rather than insulting. Olivia's face went cold, and she ended that agent's tour immediately, walking him to the door and telling him she'd be working with someone else. Frank heard the exchange from the second floor and felt something warm expand in his chest. The simple fact of someone defending him rather than expecting him to absorb casual cruelty as the price of existing in public spaces. Thursday evening, after the last agent had left and they'd locked up for the night, Olivia suggested getting dinner together to celebrate finishing the project. Frank hesitated, his instinct to refuse automatic after years of avoiding restaurants and public spaces where his presence made other diners uncomfortable. But Olivia's expression held hope that he couldn't bring himself to crush, So he agreed, following her to a small diner 3 blocks away that she promised would be quiet on weeknight evenings. They sat in a corner booth, and Frank positioned himself facing the wall to minimize how many people had a clear view of his face. An old habit that Olivia noticed but didn't comment on. The waitress approached their table and did a visible double take when she saw Frank, her professional smile faltering before she recovered and took their orders quickly. The meal was simultaneously wonderful and torturous. Olivia talked easily, carrying the conversation when Frank's responses came slowly, but never making his silence feel like a failure to participate. She asked about his life before this job, and he offered small pieces of truth, mentioning his mother's death and his years of solitary work, carefully editing out the more painful details of constant rejection and isolation. She shared more about her relationship history, how she'd spent her 20s trying to fix broken men, how her ex-boyfriend had seemed stable at first, before revealing controlling and manipulative tendencies. She said she'd learned that kindness and stability were more important than excitement or intensity, that she wanted someone who made her feel safe, rather than constantly on edge. Frank listened and wondered if she realized she was describing the exact things he'd been trying to offer her without knowing how to articulate them. Other diners stared throughout the meal, some subtly and some with open curiosity, and Frank saw Olivia notice and deliberately position herself to block their view, leaning forward conspiratorially like they were sharing secrets. She reached across the table at one point and touched his hand, a brief contact that nevertheless made several nearby tables turn to look, and Frank instinctively pulled back before remembering that she'd initiated the touch, that maybe he didn't need to protect her from association with him. The thought felt revolutionary and terrifying, the possibility that someone might choose him despite the social cost, that his presence might be worth more than the inconvenience of public judgment. When the check came, Olivia paid before Frank could offer, insisting that dinner was her way of saying thank you, and they walked back to the building in comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Friday brought the formal end of their working arrangement. Olivia met him at the building one last time to hand over his final payment and the keys so he could give them to the real estate agent she'd chosen. They stood in the empty ground floor where they'd spent so many hours, and the space felt too quiet without the sounds of their work filling it. Olivia hugged him again, longer this time, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. She said she hoped they'd stay in touch, that she'd text him once the building sold, that maybe they could get coffee sometime. Frank nodded because speaking felt impossible, his throat tight with the knowledge that this was probably the last time he'd see her, that people always meant well when they said they'd stay in touch but rarely followed through, especially when maintaining the connection required effort. She kissed his cheek quickly before leaving, the contact shocking and brief, and then she was gone, her car pulling away while Frank stood in the doorway watching until it disappeared around the corner. The week after the project ended felt impossibly long. Frank returned to his regular delivery job, but the work felt hollow after the companionship he'd experienced with Olivia. His co-workers seemed more distant than before, or maybe he was just more aware of his isolation now that he'd experienced the alternative. He checked his phone obsessively, hoping for a text that never came, telling himself it was what he'd expected even as disappointment sat heavy in his stomach. By Wednesday, he'd convinced himself that Olivia had moved on with her life, that their time together had meant less to her than it had to him, that he'd been foolish to imagine anything beyond a professional relationship. The familiar weight of loneliness settled back over him like a heavy coat, and he wondered if it would have been better to never experience connection at all, rather than having to return to isolation after tasting something different. Thursday evening brought a text that made his heart race before he'd even read the full message. Olivia apologized for being silent, explaining that the building had sold faster than expected, that she'd been dealing with paperwork and lawyers and the complicated process of settling her father's estate. She asked if he was free Saturday afternoon, if he'd like to meet for coffee, and Frank stared at his phone screen trying to decide if "like to meet for coffee" meant what he desperately hoped it meant, or if it was just friendly courtesy. He typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on a simple affirmative, and her reply came within seconds, suggesting a coffee shop in a neighborhood he didn't know but could easily find. Saturday arrived with oppressive heat that made the city shimmer with haze. Frank showered twice, changed his shirt 3 times, and spent 20 minutes trying to decide if he should wear his usual cap or leave his scars visible. He ultimately chose to go without the cap, a small act of courage that made his hands shake as he left his apartment. The coffee shop was in a trendy neighborhood he rarely visited, all exposed brick and hanging plants, filled with young professionals and artists who looked up when he entered and then quickly looked away. Olivia was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 iced coffees sweating condensation onto the wood surface. She waved him over with a genuine smile, and when he sat down, she immediately launched into conversation about the building sale, how the buyer wanted to convert it into apartments, how she'd made enough to pay off her father's debts and have a small cushion left over. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing more easily than Frank had expected given his usual struggle with words. Olivia asked about his job, and he found himself explaining his work in more detail than he'd shared before, admitting that he hated the constant loading and unloading, but couldn't afford to quit without another job lined up. She mentioned needing help with a smaller project, cleaning out a storage unit her father had rented years ago, and asked if he'd be interested in doing it next weekend for his usual rate. Frank agreed immediately, grateful for the excuse to see her again, but also aware that accepting work kept their relationship defined in ways that felt safer than acknowledging the other feelings growing between them. When they finally left the coffee shop, Olivia hugged him goodbye on the sidewalk, holding on long enough that several passers-by stopped to stare, and Frank felt the familiar shame creeping back. The knowledge that being seen with him in public cost her social capital she probably didn't realize she was spending. The week crawled past, and Saturday arrived with afternoon thunderstorms that made the city smell like rain and hot asphalt. The storage unit was in a facility on the industrial outskirts, surrounded by chain-link fence and security cameras, and Frank met Olivia at the entrance with bolt cutters to remove the lock her father's key no longer fit. Inside, the unit was smaller than the building, but somehow more overwhelming, packed floor to ceiling with boxes that bore no labels or organization. They worked in the humid heat, sweat soaking through their clothes within an hour, and the close quarters meant constant physical proximity that Frank found increasingly difficult to ignore. Around midday, Olivia found a box of old photographs, thousands of images documenting her family's history spanning decades. She sat on the concrete floor sorting through them, occasionally showing Frank pictures of her father as a young man or her mother before illness took her. One photograph showed a young girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing a pink dress and holding cotton candy at what looked like a street fair. Olivia stared at it for a long time before explaining that this was taken the summer before her mother got sick, one of her last clear memories of being completely happy and unaware that everything was about to change. Frank sat beside her, close enough that their legs touched, and she leaned her head against his shoulder without asking permission, a gesture so natural it took his breath away. They stayed that way for several minutes, her weight warm and slight against him, and Frank felt something breaking open in his chest, all the careful walls he'd built crumbling under the simple fact of being needed. When Olivia finally lifted her head, she looked directly at him, her face inches from his, and the moment stretched between them charged with possibility. Frank pulled back instinctively, standing and moving to the opposite side of the unit, busying himself with boxes to avoid the conversation his body was screaming to have. Olivia watched him retreat but didn't push, returning to the photographs with visible disappointment that made his withdrawal feel like betrayal. The afternoon deteriorated from there. Frank worked with mechanical precision, moving boxes and sorting contents without engaging Olivia in conversation, rebuilding the distance between them with deliberate effort. He told himself he was protecting her from making a mistake, that she was vulnerable and confused after her father's death and her ex-boyfriend's harassment, that she'd regret any deeper involvement with someone like him once the crisis passed and she returned to normal life. Every time she tried to bridge the gap he'd created, he found reasons to be busy or distracted, until finally she stopped trying and worked in hurt silence. When they finished and locked the unit, she asked if he wanted to get dinner, and he made an excuse about being tired, watching her face close down as she nodded and got in her car without attempting a goodbye hug. Frank walked to the bus stop feeling like he'd made a terrible mistake, but unable to see any alternative that wouldn't eventually hurt worse. He'd spent his whole life being left behind, watching people realize they'd made an error in judgment by including him, and the anticipation of that moment with Olivia felt unbearable. Better to end things now, on his terms, while he still had some control over the situation. The bus ride home took 40 minutes, and he spent every second replaying the look on her face when he'd pulled away, the hurt and confusion that he'd put there through his cowardice. By the time he reached his apartment, he'd convinced himself that cutting contact was the kindest thing he could do, that Olivia deserved someone who could give her a normal life, without the constant burden of public judgment and social isolation his presence guaranteed. Sunday morning brought a text from Olivia asking if she'd done something wrong, if he was upset with her, and Frank stared at the message trying to find words that would explain without hurting her more. He typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on something brief about needing space, about not being good at relationships, about thinking it was better if they kept things professional. Her response came 30 minutes later, shorter than his, saying she understood and hoped he was okay. The finality of it felt like a door closing, and Frank lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if the brief taste of connection had been worth the increased awareness of everything he was missing. The following week brought a return to his old patterns. He worked his delivery shifts, ate meals alone, spent evenings in his apartment avoiding his reflection in the mirror. The difference now was that solitude felt oppressive rather than merely neutral, and he caught himself thinking about Olivia at random moments, wondering what she was doing, if she was okay, if she ever thought about him. His coworkers noticed his mood had darkened beyond its usual baseline, giving him even wider berth than normal, and his supervisor commented that his work quality was slipping. Frank forced himself to focus, throwing himself into physical labor with enough intensity to exhaust his body, if not his mind. Thursday evening, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and he answered expecting a spam call or wrong number. Instead, Olivia's voice came through, small and frightened, explaining that her ex-boyfriend had been released and had shown up at her apartment, that she'd called the police but they said they couldn't do anything unless he actually threatened her, that she was scared and didn't know who else to call. Frank was moving before she finished speaking, pulling on shoes and grabbing his keys, asking for her address and telling her to lock herself in the bathroom and stay on the phone with him. The 20-minute drive felt like hours, his old truck protesting every acceleration, and he arrived to find her ex-boyfriend's car parked across the street, the man himself sitting on her apartment steps smoking a cigarette with deliberate casualness. Frank parked and got out slowly, his size making the truck rock when his weight shifted. The ex-boyfriend looked up, and his expression cycled through recognition, fear, and forced bravado. He stood and tried to swagger, saying this didn't concern Frank, that he was just talking to his girlfriend. Frank walked past him without responding, climbing the steps and knocking on Olivia's door, calling her name softly. She opened it immediately, her face wet with tears, and Frank stepped inside while keeping the door slightly open, positioning himself where he could see the ex-boyfriend, but block him from entering. The ex-boyfriend started up the steps, and Frank moved into the doorway completely, filling the frame, his silence more threatening than any words could have been. They stood that way for a full minute before the ex-boyfriend cursed and retreated to his car, peeling away with another display of unnecessary speed. Frank closed the door and locked it, then checked all the windows while Olivia sat on her couch trying to stop shaking. He moved through her small apartment methodically, testing window locks and checking the fire escape, making sure every entry point was secure. When he finished, he sat in the armchair across from her, maintaining distance because he wasn't sure if his presence was welcome after how they'd left things. She asked him to sit beside her instead, patting the couch cushion, and when he moved closer, she leaned against him heavily, her body finally relaxing now that she felt safe. They sat in silence while her breathing steadied and the adrenaline drained away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. After maybe 20 minutes, she asked why he'd come when she called, especially after he'd pushed her away. Frank struggled to find words, his throat tight with emotions he'd spent a lifetime suppressing, but finally managed to say that he'd always come when she needed him. That distance didn't change the fact that he cared about her safety more than his own comfort. Olivia lifted her head to look at him, her eyes still red from crying, and asked what he was so afraid of. The question hung between them, simple and devastating, and Frank realized she deserved an honest answer, even if giving it terrified him more than any physical threat ever could. He told her about the playground, though he didn't know yet that she was the same girl. He explained about the pink plastic ring and the promise that had been ripped away before he could respond. About learning that day that kindness from strangers was temporary and conditional, that eventually everyone realized their mistake and left. He talked about his mother's death and the funeral where people had kept their distance even while offering condolences, about the years of eating alone and working in silence, about the certainty that had settled in his bones that he was meant to be alone because his presence made other people uncomfortable. His voice broke multiple times, and he couldn't look at Olivia while speaking, couldn't bear to see pity or worse in her eyes. When he finished, the silence stretched long enough that he started to stand, ready to leave before she had to ask him to go. But Olivia grabbed his hand and held it tightly, pulling him back down beside her. She said she needed to tell him something, that she'd been trying to find the right moment, but maybe there was no right moment for some truths. She got up and went to her bedroom, returning with a small jewelry box that looked old and well-handled. Inside was a plastic ring, pink and faded, child-sized and cracked with age. She'd kept it all these years, she explained, as a reminder of the promise she'd made to a boy whose name she'd never learned, whose face she'd never forgotten despite her mother's attempts to make her. Frank stared at the ring, his mind racing to make connections his heart had already made. Olivia sat beside him and took his left hand, turning it over to examine his smallest finger where a thin white line circled the base like a permanent scar. She touched it gently and said she'd noticed the mark their first day working together, that something about it had made her chest ache without understanding why. She'd thought about that boy for 18 years, wondered if he was okay, if her mother's cruelty had damaged him beyond repair, if he'd ever found someone who saw past the surface to the person underneath. Finding Frank had felt like the universe offering a second chance, an opportunity to keep the promise her 5-year-old self had made before learning fear. Frank couldn't speak, couldn't process that the one moment of pure acceptance in his childhood had somehow led him back to the same person nearly 2 decades later. The coincidence felt impossible, and yet the evidence sat in his hand. That pink plastic ring he'd turned obsessively on his finger for months after she'd gone, until his mother had finally convinced him to take it off before it cut off circulation completely. He'd cried when she'd removed it, his child's heart understanding it was the last physical connection to the only person who'd ever chosen him, and the mark it left had stayed with him into adulthood, a permanent reminder of what he'd lost. Olivia was crying again, but these tears looked different, like relief mixed with joy mixed with grief for all the years they'd spent apart. She said she'd been looking for him without knowing it, dating men who were nothing like him, searching for someone who made her feel the way that little boy had made her feel, safe and seen and valued without having to perform or pretend. She'd recognized something in Frank from their first meeting, a familiarity she couldn't explain, and working beside him had felt like coming home after years of being lost. She asked if he could forgive her for not recognizing him sooner, for not realizing fate had given them both another chance. Frank pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her carefully like she might break or disappear if he held too tight. He said there was nothing to forgive, that he'd spent 18 years convinced that moment had been an aberration, a brief kindness before the world taught her better. He'd never imagined she might have kept the promise in her heart, even when circumstances prevented her from keeping it in reality. never considered that someone might spend years thinking about him with anything other than discomfort or disgust. The revelation was rewriting his entire understanding of his own story, suggesting that maybe he hadn't been wrong to hope, that maybe the little girl's promise had been real even if it had taken nearly 2 decades to fulfill. They held each other while the apartment grew dark around them, neither willing to move or break the moment. Eventually, Olivia pulled back just enough to look up at him, her face illuminated by streetlight coming through the window, and Frank saw the same directness in her eyes that he remembered from the playground, that unwavering certainty that had terrified and thrilled him even as a child. She kissed him softly, and this time when she touched his face, tracing the scars that had defined so much of his life, he didn't pull away or try to hide. He kissed her back and let himself believe that maybe this was real, that maybe the story that started on a playground could have a different ending than the one he'd spent his whole life expecting. Olivia collapsed onto her couch, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and relief, and Frank stood awkwardly in her small living room, unsure whether to stay or leave now that the immediate threat had passed. She asked him to sit, her voice steadier than her hands, and he perched on the edge of an armchair that seemed too delicate for his weight. They sat in silence for several minutes before she spoke, thanking him for coming, apologizing for calling him after he'd said he needed space, explaining that he was the only person she'd felt safe asking for help. Frank wanted to say that he'd always come when she needed him, that pushing her away had been about his fears rather than anything she'd done wrong. But the words tangled in his throat the way they always did when emotions ran too high. She asked why he'd pulled away at the storage unit, her voice quiet but direct, demanding honesty he wasn't sure he knew how to give. Frank looked at his hands, scarred and oversized, and tried to find a language for the lifetime of rejection that had taught him to expect abandonment, to protect himself by leaving first. He explained haltingly about the little girl in the playground who'd made a promise she couldn't keep, about his mother's exhaustion from defending him, about every person who'd looked at him with revulsion or pity, about the certainty that anyone who got close would eventually realize their mistake and leave. His voice broke on the last words, decades of suppressed pain rising to the surface, and he couldn't look at Olivia while speaking, couldn't bear to see her face confirm what he already believed about himself. Olivia moved from the couch to kneel in front of his chair, forcing herself into his line of sight, and when he tried to turn away, she touched his face gently, her small hand resting against the scarred side of his jaw. She said she remembered the playground, remembered the pink plastic ring she'd placed on his finger, remembered being yanked away by her mother, who was terrified of anything different. She'd spent years thinking about that boy, wondering what happened to him, whether her mother's cruelty had damaged him the way it had damaged her. She said finding Frank had felt like fate offering a second chance, an opportunity to keep the promise her 5-year-old self had made before learning to be afraid. Frank stared at her, trying to process the revelation that she was that little girl grown up, that the one moment of pure acceptance in his childhood had somehow led him back to the same person 18 years later. The coincidence felt impossible, and yet her face held certainty, her eyes searching his for recognition. She pulled her phone out and showed him a photograph, the same one she'd found in the storage unit, and he saw himself in the background, small for his age but already marked by the scars that would define his life, sitting alone on a swing while other children played far away. The memory clicked into place, sharp and painful, and he realized the ring she'd given him had left a permanent mark where it had been too tight for his growing finger, a thin white line he'd assumed was just another scar. Olivia took his left hand and traced the mark on his smallest finger, her touch feather-light, and said she'd noticed it the first day they worked together, that it had made her heart skip without understanding why. She explained that she'd left part of herself on that playground, the part that believed love was supposed to be unconditional and simple, and that meeting him again had reminded her what she'd lost by learning to be practical and careful. She said he'd saved her in ways that had nothing to do with physical protection, that his quiet presence had shown her what stability actually looked like, that she trusted him in ways she'd never trusted anyone else because he'd never tried to be anything other than exactly who he was. Frank listened, his throat tight, and realized she was offering him something he'd spent his whole life believing was impossible. She wasn't confused or vulnerable or making a mistake. She was choosing him with full awareness of what that choice meant, of the stares and the whispers and the social cost of being with someone the world had decided was unacceptable. She was looking at him the same way that 5-year-old girl had, with directness and certainty, seeing him rather than his appearance, and this time there was no mother to pull her away, no outside force to interrupt the moment. He pulled her up from the floor and onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her carefully, and she fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her hands gripping his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear. They stayed that way for a long time, adjusting to the reality of being allowed to touch each other, learning the weight and warmth of another person who chose to be close. Olivia eventually pulled back just enough to look up at him, and before he could retreat into old habits of self-protection, she kissed him. The contact was gentle and questioning, giving him space to pull away if he wanted, but he didn't want to. He kissed her back, pouring 18 years of loneliness and hope into the connection, and she responded with equal intensity, her hands moving to his face, tracing the scars she'd spent weeks carefully not staring at. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she smiled and said she'd kept her promise. It had just taken longer than either of them expected. The following weeks brought adjustments that were sometimes difficult, but never impossible. Olivia introduced Frank to her friends, and while some struggled with discomfort they tried to hide, others accepted him with the casual friendliness of people who trusted Olivia's judgment. They went to restaurants and movies and normal places that Frank had spent years avoiding. And yes, people stared, but Olivia handled it with confidence that made the attention feel less important than his presence beside her. She held his hand in public, kissed him on street corners, introduced him as her boyfriend with pride rather than embarrassment, and slowly Frank began to believe that maybe he'd been wrong about how the story had to end. They moved in together after 3 months, finding a small apartment with good light and space for Olivia's art supplies and Frank's few possessions. Olivia pushed him to look for better work, and he found a job with a moving company that paid more and treated him with basic respect. His size an asset rather than something to be feared. They adopted a 3-legged cat from a shelter, drawn to its perfect imperfection, and Frank discovered he had a capacity for tenderness he'd never known existed. Life wasn't perfect or easy, and there were still moments when shame crept back in, or when strangers said cruel things. But Olivia's presence made those moments bearable in ways they'd never been before. One Sunday morning, Frank woke to find Olivia already awake, propped on one elbow watching him with an expression he'd learned to recognize as love. She asked if he remembered what she'd said on the playground, and he nodded. The memory no longer painful but precious, proof that connection had always been possible if he'd just believed in it. She pulled a small box from the nightstand and opened it, revealing 2 simple gold bands, and asked if he'd marry her. Frank couldn't speak past the emotion closing his throat, so he just nodded and pulled her close, holding her while she cried happy tears into his chest. They lay there as morning light filled the room, planning a small courthouse wedding with only the people who mattered, beginning the next chapter of a story that had started 18 years ago with a child's promise and a plastic ring. The wedding was simple and perfect, exactly what they both wanted. Olivia wore a sundress the color of the sky, and Frank wore a suit that had to be custom-ordered to fit his frame. And when the judge asked if they took each other, their voices were steady and certain. The handful of guests threw rice on the courthouse steps, and Frank didn't care about the passers-by who stopped to stare, because Olivia was laughing beside him, her hand in his, the gold band on her finger catching sunlight. They went home to their small apartment and ate takeout on the couch with the 3-legged cat between them, and it was ordinary and mundane and more than Frank had ever dared hope for. Years later, people would ask how they met, and Olivia would tell them the truth, that she'd made a promise as a child and kept it as an adult, that sometimes the best love stories took decades to unfold, that the person you were meant to find might be waiting right where you'd left them. Frank would add little to these conversations, content to let Olivia tell their story, but occasionally he'd touch the thin white line on his smallest finger and remember the moment his life changed, not once but twice, in a playground and then in a hardware store, by the same person who'd seen him as worthy of love before either of them understood what that meant. So what did you think of this story? Did Frank and Olivia's journey touch your heart? If you loved seeing how love finds us when we least expect it, and how promises made in childhood can shape our entire lives, hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling me which moment made you believe in fate and second chances. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about love, redemption, and the beautiful chaos of finding where you truly belong. See you in the next one.